Jasper here. Today I'll be talking about what I would think if Scott kept his self-sabotage strategy from Revenge into All-Stars. If you didn't know, in Revenge of the Island, Scott had a strategy to sabotage his own team in challenges to get someone from his team out and to create a false sense of security for the other team. In this what if, Scott would think about doing the self-sabotage and starts again from the beginning. Now this was suggested by someone. I'm sorry, but I sadly lost a comment because I accidentally deleted my screenshot. So if you're the person who commented it, just comment it again and I'll pin it down below. Also, suggest in the comments ideas for Pahkitew Island. I'll be more likely to choose your comment if the what if scenario is more game changing. Also, comment early. I take a day to look through ideas and I start to write them the next day. There are spoilers, but if you don't care, enjoy. Everyone has to do the key finding challenge. Lindsay and Joe would still push the strollers. Scott would have his fear of sharks kick in, and he tries not to jump. Later, Lightning and Duncan would force Scott to jump, but Scott is too afraid. This is where the what if would start. Instead of hitting Alejandro, Scott would actually fall into the water. As Scott is falling down, this reignites his memory of Lightning being annoying to him last season with his shuck quirks. Scott would meet up with the sharks, and he would be screaming as he tries to escape the sharks. He would swim around for a little bit before Fang gets a hold of him. Meanwhile, the villains would notice Scott is kind of taking a while, both Joe and everyone else on the top. Soon, Gwen would check up on Scott to see that he's being beaten up by the sharks, so she starts throwing rocks in an attempt to get rid of the sharks. Mike and Cameron would see Gwen throwing rocks and would ask what she's doing, and Gwen tells them to throw rocks to get rid of the sharks. With the three throwing rocks, they save Scott, and he is able to get the key and to Joe, who asks him what took so long. Scott would say that the sharks were beating him, and Joe wouldn't care for Scott's safety and would ask, couldn't you have fought back? Scott is not happy that Joe literally doesn't care about his safety, nor the team's with that attitude. The key won't work as I don't think Scott would be in Alejandro's spot. Everyone on villains would have jumped, except for Alejandro, who's still in the robot suit. Duncan and Lightning would question if they should even push the robot or if they should go again. Chris would announce that the heroes are in the league for the first time, which causes the two to push the robot instead, and the two would chuckle as Lightning's like, shut, oops. Alejandro would still emerge from the robot suit, grabbing the right key, and winning the challenge. After this challenge, Scott would ask everyone who threw the rocks at the sharks. Only Duncan cares enough to watch Gwen, so he'd respond with Gwen. Gwen would nervously say she, Mike, and Cameron threw the rocks. Scott would grab Gwen, Mike, and Cameron to thank them for saving his life, and the three would be like, no problem, happy to help. Scott would now have a sense that he can trust the three as they've saved his life. He thinks he can trust Gwen, as he doesn't like Lightning or Joe, and doesn't know the others. In the elimination, Gwen would try to give Courtney flowers, as she wants to be friends with her for some reason. Scott would see Courtney rejecting the flowers and would now see that he should help Gwen befriend Courtney so he can return the favor and hopefully have her trust. I don't think there's a reason why the votes would change, nor do I think Scott would influence the votes, as he has nothing against the heroes, so Lindsay is still out due to not knowing basic motor functions. Lightning would still go volunteer to Boney Island. Chris would announce the immunity idol, and this is where Scott would reopen his self-sabotage plan from Revenge to get peeps like Joe and Lightning out, and to find the immunity idol, and carve one while he's sabotaging. He would explain all that in a confessional. That's a way to start this what if, am I right? Okay, here Mike would be dreaming, Sierra would be on her phone, and we can see Scott sit next to Gwen to know her a bit better. The two kind of get along, with Gwen talking about her daily life and Scott talking about his farm. Heather and Alejandro would bicker over not receiving text. Duncan would try to sit next to Gwen, and he awkwardly asks how her sleep was, and Gwen just stares at Duncan. Scott would notice the weird interaction, and would think that Gwen needs to be away from Duncan. Joe would ask everyone about voting Lightning out. Duncan and Scott are in, and Gwen doesn't care. Now Scott would want to get Lightning out as he's annoying, but he realizes that he doesn't want to give up the luxury of the spa hotel. But he decides to sabotage with uncertainty. In the statue challenge, we can see Cameron activating Manitoba Smith after setting off a bomb that gives a hat. Scott would see Manitoba in action and grins that his sabotaging job is much easier as Manitoba would find stuff much quicker. Heather and Joe would be bickering over who should be leader. Joe would ask Scott if I'm the leader, right? Trying to reassure that she's the leader. Scott would just say yes, but he realizes that Joe and Heather could be a threat due to how power-hungry they are. The two continue arguing, and Scott would sabotage by trying to dig up the hero statues, exposing them, and digging up the villain's pieces and hiding them on the hero side. While digging up the villain statues, Scott would ask Gwen why she wants to befriend Courtney, and Gwen would say that she felt kind of bad she took Duncan from Courtney, and wants to repair their friendship before all that happened, as she and Courtney kinda got along before the expose. Scott would understand and would promise to help her become friends with Courtney again. Gwen would appreciate Scott's promise very much, and now has some trust that Scott will help her. Because of this talk, Alejandro is not able to riz Gwen. Because Scott isn't hiding the hero's pieces, yep, Mal is not gonna happen, guys. Mal is not happening. This is like a 2-in-1 what if. What if Scott and what if Mal didn't exist? Wow. I love writing what ifs. Because Scott didn't hit Manitoba in the head, Manitoba is able to find all the pieces real quick, and the heroes are able to finish their statue before the villains even start constructing their statue. Joe is angry at Heather for sabotaging the team, and blaming the sabotage on her. Heather would claim that she did nothing, and Joe did the sabotaging. Yeah, the two bicker. Scott would want to get Joe out, as she's the bigger threat if she forces everyone to reassure everyone else that she's the leader. Scott and Gwen would congratulate Mike and Cameron for winning, and Sam would be exiled. When Gwen congratulates Courtney, Scott would be there to make sure the congratulation goes well. Gwen sets off the trash and it hits it, but Scott would save Courtney in time by jumping into the trash to save her. Courtney would thank Scott, but would take jabs at Gwen. Yeah, Scott and Gwen are not happy with this encounter, but they reassure themselves that they will do better. In the elimination, Mal would not emerge and say some words. Scott would tell Gwen and Lightning separately to vote for Joe for being bossy. Heather would vote for Joe, of course, and Duncan would see Joe as a more controlling, and she failed the team for this challenge, so he puts his vote on her. With 6 votes, Joe is out. In the night, Mike would not turn into Mal and destroy Sam's game guy. In the morning, we see the heroes enjoying the luxury of the spa hotel, and we can see Sierra start to obsess over Cameron a bit. Like, Sierra would be calling Cameron Cody sometimes, and would start to stick with him more by sitting next to him on the table. Alejandro knows that he needs allies on his team for the next vote. He says in the confessional that he was kind of lucky that Joe failed the team. He wants to manipulate Lightning to being in an alliance with him, and he feels he can do a favor for Duncan to get him in the alliance. Later, Sam would arrive, bruised from being exiled, and everyone but Courtney on the heroes would care for Sam. The heroes would get a head start in the challenge for winning. Mike would have a confession saying Courtney might be scary, although this time he would still have the thought after the confession. Zoe would jump up a tree to have a better look, and Courtney would still have her comment about getting Zoe out. I still think the villains are able to get the bigger crate. Scott at the moment sees Heather as a big threat for her controlling nature, so he'd want to get the cannon to hopefully get Heather out and then the rest of the team, so he can convince everyone to vote for Heather. His plan is a bit interrupted when Scott allows Gwen to stay with him for safety. Soon Alejandro would take Duncan with him for a talk, and before he's about to take Lightning too, Lightning would grab his gun, hoping to shoot people alone. Heather would see that she's alone and doesn't want to be with Alejandro, so she'll follow Gwen and Scott. Heather wants to be leader of the team, but she realizes that she needs the respect of her teammates, because Joe did not seem to have any of that and she got voted off. Heather would thank Gwen and Scott for voting off Joe. Gwen and Scott are just like, sure, and Heather really wants the respect and would pretend to drop the leader act. Heather would promise that she will be a better team player rather than a leader, so we can win challenges. Gwen and Scott appreciate that a little bit and let Heather stay. Duncan would tell Alejandro that he's been having trouble connecting with Gwen as he came back to the show for her, but Gwen doesn't seem to like him. Alejandro knows he can ally with Duncan, so he would give tips on how to get to Gwen's heart. Alejandro would share to Duncan that being over-obsessive over her and asking for a kiss is not a good way to connect with her. Instead, he should apologize for his faults or being overly obsessive, and he should tell Gwen that he just wants a new start. Duncan can help her more and be with her and talk about common interests. After hearing this advice, Duncan considers going to Gwen and asking for that. Duncan would thank Alejandro as he runs off to see Gwen. While walking, Scott would pretend that he's trying to tie his shoe and tells Gwen to look around for any enemy and tells Heather to guard him. As Gwen is away and Heather has her back turned, Scott would aim the cannon at Heather, but before he can shoot, Zoe is able to shoot him, causing Scott to pass out. Gwen and Heather would be terrified of how Zoe was able to sneak up. As they see Zoe escape, they tell each other that they need to step up their game if they want to win. Now Mike would be able to access his personality since Mal is not getting in the way. Sierra would be holding onto Cameron so tight, protecting him from the villains. Sierra would be commenting on how cute Cody is, and would imagine Cameron as Cody, which really creeps him out. Cameron would activate Svetlana to give Mike an edge on shooting, and Svetlana would jump away. Lightning sees Cameron and hides in a bush. Lightning still thinks Cameron is a weakling, and he thinks he can shoot Cameron. As he's hiding, he throws a rock to distract Sierra, and while Sierra isn't looking, Lightning ambushes Cameron, getting him out. Sierra retaliates and uses Cameron to throw at Lightning. Lightning gets hit, and Sierra gets him out. Alejandro is able to find the cave with Sam and Courtney. Courtney would still miss and would use Sam as a shield. Alejandro would poke fun at Courtney, saying that using Sam is such a villainous move, and Courtney would claim she's not evil. And Alejandro dismisses, shooting her. Impressive. Duncan meets up with Gwen and Heather, who are not happy to see him. Duncan would tell Gwen that he's sorry for being a bit weird recently, and Gwen would dismiss the apology as she thinks Duncan is just distracting her. Heather would also tell Duncan to get in the game. As Duncan is talking, Sierra would shoot, with knocked out Cameron on her side. Sierra misses, but Duncan's able to shoot Sierra. Gwen would thank Duncan, but Duncan would tell Gwen that he wants to start things all over for real. Heather is disgusted with the lovey-dovey talk and would walk off, but later be shot by Zoe. Duncan would tell Gwen that he doesn't want love right now, and he wants to start with a new friendship, forgetting everything that happened before. Gwen would kinda be interested in this. Duncan would also tell Gwen that if she needs help, he hopes that he can be the one to help, which pleases Gwen. Svetlana would sneak up on the two, but Duncan wouldn't notice her from the corner of his eye. Svetlana would sneak up on the two, but Duncan would notice her from the corner of his eye, and as Svetlana shoots at Gwen, Duncan jumps in front, saving Gwen from the leech. Gwen is able to use Duncan's gun to double shoot at Svetlana very quickly, which is able to get Svetlana out within a few leeches. Duncan would dramatically pass out, telling Gwen to hide until the challenge is over, and Gwen would have newfound respect for Duncan. Oh yeah, I should mention, Zoe would probably be spooked, knowing that she's the last member standing. She would almost go commando mode. Alejandro would know now that it's only he and one more of his teammates left, so he embarks to find the other member. I'm sure soon Alejandro finds Gwen and tells her that they should team up to hunt the last player. While looking for Zoe, Alejandro asks Gwen about her friendship with Duncan and how it's going. Gwen admits that she kinda wants to friend Duncan, as he said he'd stop being weird, but at the same time, she just wants to friend Courtney again. But friending Duncan can get in the way, as Courtney would just see Gwen stealing Duncan again. Alejandro would tell Gwen that she and Duncan need each other and should stick together, as Courtney is just toxic and can't stick with you. Gwen takes these words into consideration. To get Zoe, Alejandro makes a plan to get Zoe to shoot Gwen, and he's able to ambush Zoe from above. Gwen would now be pretending to be alone and scared so Zoe can shoot her. Basically, this works as Gwen is shot, but Alejandro is able to know where Zoe shot, would jump down to shoot Zoe, winning the challenge for the villains. In the elimination, Scott would volunteer to be exiled. I think Gwen would have a feeling of concern for Scott, but he says he'll be okay, and Gwen should stay away from Zoe and keep making it good with Courtney. Courtney would complain about her team, which Mike and Zoe don't like, but Cameron would pull the two and ask them to vote for Sierra, as she has gotten too obsessive with him. Mike would question, shouldn't we deal with the bigger threat, but Cameron would be begging the two to vote for Sierra, which they are now convinced to do. Also, Cameron would tell Sierra to just vote for Courtney. With 3, maybe 4 votes with Courtney's vote against 2 to Courtney, Sierra is out and is crying that she is separated from Cody. Cameron is relieved, but Chris announces that 2 people are switching, as someone on the team was acting like a villain. Yeah, Courtney and Duncan are switching. Courtney would complain she's not a villain, and Duncan would accept his defeat, and Gwen would kind of be sad. Not gonna lie, I spent 5 hours writing that one episode. Overnight, we can see Gwen trying to interact with Courtney, but Courtney would just push her away, as she doesn't want anything to do with Gwen. Gwen knows Alejandro doesn't want her to friend Courtney, so she goes to Heather, who, as her last option. Gwen asks Heather what she can do to befriend Courtney, and Heather doesn't like Courtney. Something like, you don't, but she wants Gwen to be her ally on the team, so Heather tries to say something nice, and she awkwardly tells Gwen to save some breakfast for Courtney. Gwen is unsatisfied, thanks Heather for the advice. It cuts to a confessional where Gwen would express how she misses Scott and hopes he's okay. She also explains she can't choose between trusting Alejandro for Duncan or Scott for Courtney. Duncan has been real nice lately, and Courtney hasn't. Later, Scott would come back with no immunity idol. He tells Gwen this, but Gwen cares more that Scott is here. Chris explains the challenge. I'll explain how the challenge goes briefly, or else this video would be millions of years longer. So Lightning would go first, and he asks if the pancakes are protein packed, and Alejandro lies yes, so the villains get an edge with Lightning eating a ton. The villains choose Sam, or the heroes choose Sam, as they don't want to go against Lightning. Next, when Lightning finishes early, Alejandro and Heather would not be fighting over team leader, so they choose Courtney, who would be complaining that she is forced to because she's a test dummy to Heather and Alejandro, but Gwen would see this as a perfect time to make Courtney happy. She'd volunteer so Courtney won't have to go. Alejandro would try to top this by telling Duncan that he should go. Courtney would thank Gwen a little bit, and Gwen would tell Courtney that if she needs something, she can ask her. Scott would tell Alejandro that Duncan and Gwen are not a fair matchup. He just wants Gwen to do a favor and not interact with Duncan, seeing how awkward he was previously. Scott would advocate for someone else of similar strength to go, but Alejandro eyes Scott and shuts him, forcing Duncan to go with Gwen. Duncan is pretty happy. He can smile and maybe help Gwen. Throughout the run, the two would motivate each other and wouldn't continue without each other. Alejandro is happy, Heather doesn't care, and Scott starts to think Alejandro wants Gwen to be with Duncan rather than Courtney. Soon, Courtney would go after having newfound confidence. She munches down the pancake and she is splattered with green jelly, which costs the villain a lot of time. In fact, giving a slight edge because Courtney freaking out. Gwen and Scott would cheer on Courtney to keep moving, but Alejandro and Heather facepalm. Alejandro notices Heather facepalm at the same time and would mention to Heather that they both dislike Courtney and great minds think alike, but Heather would just say ew and moves towards Gwen and Scott. Next is Scott, but would he sabotage? I don't think so, as he wants to know more of Alejandro's motives, to see if he should sabotage to get him out or not. Between the two teams, I think villains win, as a lot of the pancake was eaten by Lightning, and I'm sure Scott and Alejandro make up for the lost time rather than Cameron and Mike eating faster. Before the elimination, Gwen would tell Mike, Cameron, and Zoe to not vote off Duncan, as she still wants to be with Duncan for longer. The three friends see nothing wrong, and they agree to vote off Sam. Later in the elimination, Duncan would tell his team they better not vote him out because he's the only bad boy on the team. Alejandro hears Duncan assuring he's bad, and he would think this can get in the way of him and Gwen, so he would approach him tomorrow. Yeah, Sam is getting out as everyone votes for him, and Chris tells everyone that Sam stuffed his pockets with pancakes. Yeah, Sam is not an all-star, and Scott would again volunteer for exile, which worries Gwen and Courtney. In the beginning, when we see Scott is dropped off, we can see Gwen and Courtney caring for Scott, and asking if he's okay and stuff. Gwen would comment to Courtney that she didn't know she was caring of Scott, and Courtney would claim that Scott could have been killed and would help anyone who has gone through a dangerous situation. Gwen asked Courtney if she would do the same for her, and assures Courtney that she would save her too. Courtney is hesitant on helping Gwen, but she feels Scott would prefer if Courtney would save Gwen too, so Courtney says yes out of her liking towards Scott. Gwen would hug Courtney, which Courtney would appreciate. Soon, Courtney would have a confession, saying she thought she would never trust Gwen again, but Gwen seems genuine on a friendship, and she would also mention that she thinks Scott is a part of the reason why she acknowledges she might care about him, and even jokes that she cares about him more than Gwen. Alejandro noticed Gwen and Courtney's bonding. Chris announces the challenge and the moon's effects. Soon, the moon comes out, and Heather would still pretend to be nice to mess with Alejandro. Alejandro's shock in Heather would gain the attention of Scott, who notices this change and hopes to use this knowledge to his advantage to get him out, as he hasn't been supportive of Gwen befriending Courtney thus far. Lightning would tell everyone that they're going a bit slow, so he would run off from the villains. Lightning would tell everyone they're going a bit slow, and he would run off to the villains. Heather, being nice, would tell Lightning to stay with the villains as a group, but ends up running to get him back. This shocks Alejandro, as he thought Heather wouldn't care, but now she's gone. Alejandro would not be told to stay with the group, so he tries to look for Duncan from behind. For the heroes, well, the bacon hats, I think Manitoba Smith can be activated. Cameron and Zoe are pretty happy because Manitoba can navigate and can fend off dangerous animals. Alejandro is able to find Duncan and take him out to talk. As Alejandro's doing this, Manitoba Smith would question Duncan on why he's leaving the group, and Zoe questions why Alejandro's here. Alejandro claims that Duncan will be back soon, but Manitoba puts his hands on Duncan. After a quick tug, Alejandro's able to grab Duncan to talk. Cameron has a confessional where he thinks Alejandro's gonna plot with Duncan to make the heroes lose in challenges, so he and the villains can get to the merge. He tells Zoe and Mike about this, and they all agree to move a bit faster. In the talk, Alejandro expresses his concerns with Courtney friending Gwen, as if this happens, Scott has the numbers to vote him out. Alejandro tells Duncan, you have to isolate yourself with Gwen, and Duncan agrees to stay with Gwen for the duration of the challenge. Alejandro sneaks behind where Gwen and Courtney are talking, and would tell Courtney that he needs Gwen for a moment. Courtney would yell, telling Alejandro it better not be any funny business. Alejandro leaves Gwen with Duncan for them to have their moments. Duncan starts to talk by asking how was her sleep. When Alejandro comes back, Scott would straight up accuse Alejandro of getting in the way of Gwen and sabotaging the team by getting Gwen distracted by Duncan. Courtney would freak out hearing that Alejandro is separating her and Gwen, and would be arguing with Al. While arguing, the heroes pass them, and Alejandro would tell the villains and Gwen to run. Heather and Lightning are past the bridge, and Heather's angry that her friendliness didn't mess with Alejandro one bit, and Lightning is distracted too much. They cross the finish with Lightning celebrating, but Heather having incentives to get Lightning out. As the teams are running, Lightning would see that the heroes are on the bridge, and without talking, he breaks the bridge, causing the heroes to fall. But Heather would tell Lightning that their team can't pass. Oops. But in the original, Duncan somehow avoided the bridge, so I'm sure he and Gwen can find a shortcut, and would tell the others to go through it. Yeah, villains win again. Gwen and Duncan celebrate, but Duncan mentions that this might be the last time I compete, and that gets Gwen heartfelt as she remembers Duncan is on the heroes team. Gwen would cry about this, but Duncan would comfort her that it'll be alright, and she should keep competing, and Alejandro can help her. Courtney would be so over the relationship, and Scott would tell Alejandro to back off from Gwen. In the elimination, Duncan gives Gwen a kiss on the lips, which Alejandro's happy about, but Scott and Courtney would be angry that they let this happen. Yeah, these three think that Duncan is sabotaging, so they vote him out. Well, actually, the votes are for a team swap, so that means Duncan is on the villains team again. Gwen would be so happy, Alejandro too, but Courtney is freaking out, and Scott too. Yeah, Scott volunteers again. The episode goes like this. Alejandro and Gwen welcome Duncan back to the team. And Gwen gives Duncan a kiss, and Courtney acknowledges she failed to befriend Gwen, since that's what Scott and Gwen wanted, and she doesn't want to take Gwen's happiness away. Alejandro is thrilled that his plan works, and he can hopefully get Courtney and Scott out one by one. The Fun Zone challenge would still happen. Scott arrives with Courtney, who is glad that Scott's alive, and would mention that it's too late as she points to Gwen and Duncan. Scott acknowledges and would say that we should spend more time since we are the least of Gwen's worries, and Courtney would kind of be down for that. Heather just wants to vote out Lightning, so she would ask Scott, who she tried to ally with, to help get Lightning out, but Scott would say Lightning isn't a threat, and he's good at challenges. Soon the contestants arrive at Boney Island for the egg-finding challenge. Cameron would activate Manitoba again. Okay, these three haven't done much. I'm sorry, y'all, but they will get some stuff later. Heather asks Duncan, who brings her to Alejandro, to vote for Lightning. Alejandro would take this chance to convince Heather to get rid of Courtney, not Scott, because Heather went with Scott in episode 3. Heather would yell that Lightning is annoying and can cause a challenge for the team if he departs from our team, which he does every time. Alejandro pretends to agree, but if they vote out Courtney first, Heather would complain they should get Lightning first, but Alejandro would say he's the only one willing to vote for Courtney, and he claims that he has more than half of the team on his side. So this would get to Heather, and she agrees to vote for Courtney. Alejandro tells Heather to stick with Lightning to make sure he does the challenge and votes for Courtney. At this point, heroes can find a bunch of eggs. Courtney and Scott would be looking for eggs, but they would give up to make time for each other. They decide to watch the eggs, but they meet up with Gwen and Duncan, who are also watching the eggs. We would have a scene where Courtney and Gwen are just happy for each other, and Duncan and Scott are eyeing each other, because they know what has happened, and what they're gonna do. But soon after, Scott would go alone for immunity hunting. As Heather's helping Lightning find eggs, Lightning would crack the same egg with immunity idol in it. Once the egg cracks, Heather is able to see it, and moments later, she would swipe it out of Lightning's hands while he's holding it up to see its beauty. Lightning would get very mad and chase after her, but soon Heather's able to whack Lightning with a tree branch, knocking him out. Heather would still hide the immunity idol, but this time Alejandro was watching and Scott would come looking for it. Heather would tell Alejandro that he's never gonna find it. After she leaves, Alejandro would go for it, but Scott would stop him, telling him that he's not gonna steal his immunity idol, and grabs it and leaves. Alejandro is angered that Scott just happened to be there, and he knows Scott has been looking for it himself for a bit now, and plans to vote out Courtney, since she doesn't have the idol. Later, the heroes win as they still find out 17 eggs. I don't know. Alejandro brings Duncan and Gwen to vote out Courtney. Gwen doesn't want to, of course, so she just suggests Heather, since she lost her immunity idol, and isn't as athletic or as useful as Lightning. Alejandro would remind Gwen that they have Heather's vote, so if they wouldn't want her out. After this talk, Gwen is bummed that she has to vote for Courtney. Meanwhile, Scott gives the immunity idol to Courtney, to hopefully outsmart Alejandro. Courtney says, if this plan works, I love you. This flatters Scott, as he didn't really expect Courtney to fall in love with him. Scott would come up to Lightning, asking if he can vote for Alejandro. Scott would make the claim that Alejandro was about to steal the immunity idol from you, and vote for you tonight, and Lightning reluctantly agrees to vote for Al. In the vote, it's 3 votes against Courtney and 3 against Alejandro. Gwen probably wouldn't vote for anyone here, so that would mean a tiebreaker. Alejandro's so ready for a tiebreaker, but Courtney pulls her immunity idol, which completely shocks Al, Duncan, and Heather, and that means Alejandro is out. Dang, this worked. Oh yeah, and Cameron would volunteer, but Zoe and Mike would worry too much, and Zoe takes his place. In the morning, Duncan would be talking to Heather about kind of being sad Alejandro left, as he helped him get back with Gwen. Heather would be mixed on Alejandro leaving. She'd be going back and forth on how glad she is and how sad she is, creating a funny scene, and Duncan saying Heather's in love with the guy, which grosses Heather, and she leaves Duncan. Heather notices that she doesn't have any allies because Duncan and Gwen and Scott and Courtney are too focused kissing each other, and Lightning sabotages the team. So she sets her eyes on allying with the heroes so she can have allies when the merge happens. But that means Heather should work with Duncan and Gwen for a little for their votes if they lose. Okay, so for this challenge, I'll keep this a bit short. Heroes get 1 point. As Mike points out, Chris promised an advantage. Lightning would want to go first, but Scott too, so Scott would hit Lightning with a 2x4, knocking him out. Scott gets Fang and doesn't win. Courtney would be by Scott's side, caring for him, and Gwen would also help Scott a little bit, which Duncan is not having, but Courtney would appreciate Gwen's helpfulness. Cameron is next. He gets Izzy. Heather would tell the three that they need to win, so they can get Lightning out, who would be a big threat in the merge, and Heather plans to only be happy when the heroes win to show support. Izzy beats Cameron up. Heather's next, and she gets the sumo wrestler. Heather realizes if her team loses, she and Duncan and Gwen can get Lightning out, so the heroes would cheer for her a little bit, and Gwen finds that a bit suspicious, but doesn't think much. Heather wouldn't duck and instead get bounced around, losing. Courtney would comment about the team being weak. Cameron would still notice the challenge is rigged, and tells Chris to stop rigging the challenge, which Chris complies with. Mike is next and gets the bear. Cameron would activate Vito, who ends up beating the bear with his power. Next is Duncan, who gets the bird. Courtney would force Duncan to beat it, but he wouldn't because he has a heart. After the battle, Duncan tells everyone that he's still a bad boy, but Gwen would assure Duncan he is a bad boy, and it's okay to have a heart, and he shouldn't focus or prove himself to be bad. He already is, which gets Duncan to stop getting mad at people for calling him nice. Next is Zoe. Chris would find it funny to rig it one more time, and give Zoe a jock, being Lightning. Lightning thinks the fight would be easy and trash talks Zoe, which causes her to go commando, and I actually think Commando Zoe can beat Lightning if she plays it smart. With 3 points, the heroes win, and Heather would congratulate the heroes for winning. Gwen would confront Heather on why she's supporting the heroes a bit too much, and Heather would say she's just good friends with the heroes, but Gwen wouldn't buy and would keep her eye on Heather and make sure she's not sabotaging in any way. In the elimination, Heather would still tell Duncan and Gwen to vote for Lightning. Duncan would simply ask Gwen nicely, which gets Gwen on board, but Chris reveals that the winners are voting for who goes out. Gwen and Heather head straight to the heroes to plead their case. Heather argues she thinks heroes are strong and talented and what they do, and they should vote Lightning because he's going to be a threat in the merge. But Gwen says Heather's going to be a threat in the merge because she will manipulate you guys and will vote you off later. Now, these three think extensively, but they come to the conclusion that they should give Heather the benefit of the doubt, and they'll listen to her this time, because maybe she's right about Lightning being a threat, and maybe she's not a manipulative liar. Gwen facepalms and Heather's yay. The three also tell Gwen that Mike should go this time to Boney Island. So Cameron announces that Lightning is out, which gets Lightning so angry and almost beats Cameron's ass up, but is stopped by Heather, who wishes Lightning a better brain. And Gwen would announce Mike is going to Boney Island. Yep, Heather is manipulating the three. Also, did I mention that I love writing what ifs? As Mike arrives from Boney Island, Chris announces the merge. Let's go. Heather has a confessional showing off her evil laugh as she thinks she dominates this game, having 3 allies. Gwen would tell Courtney, Duncan, and Scott that they need to get Heather out because she appears to be the biggest threat, and they should also warn Cameron, Mike, and Zoe about her. Scott would acknowledge Heather's a threat, and he needs to sabotage her and her team. Because Mal is not here, he would not sabotage the boats for some reason. Heather takes the boat of losers along with Cameron, Mike, and Zoe. Courtney and Scott go together, and Gwen and Duncan as a couple. Courtney and Scott take the red boat, and Gwen and Duncan take the purple boat. Now, even though Scott is working with Duncan and Gwen to beat Heather, he still wants immunity and the mansion to himself. And Courtney, and after Heather's out, he sees Zoe as a threat and Duncan as an untrustworthy and might manipulate Courtney. At first, everything is smooth sailing, literally, and then Scott gets pretty competitive and starts ramming his boat into Duncan's. Courtney and Gwen would question Scott, but Duncan would retaliate with, "Oh, you want it like that, huh?" and proceeds to ram Scott's boat. The two fight a lot, even with the girls telling them to stop, but it's until Heather gets a slight lead, and passes in between the boats is when they stop. Gwen and Courtney would worry, but Duncan and Scott would know what to do, and they rammed their boats into Heather's, but they only rammed the back, and the ramming was insignificant damage. Everyone enters Coconut Alley, and Heather would tell the three to throw coconuts at the two boats. Gwen would tell Cameron and Zoe to throw coconuts at them, and said Heather because they can stop her. Cameron and Zoe replied that they don't need to stop her, and they're sorry, and they bash Duncan and Gwen with coconuts. On the other side of the boat, Mike throws coconuts hard at the engine, causing Scott's engine to break. Just before they completely stop, Scott grabs the paddle and jumps onto Heather's boat, leaving Courtney behind. Scott would apologize to Cameron and whacks him with the paddle. Heather hears the whack and tells Mike to do something. Cameron hears, and before passing out, he rips Mike's shirt, activating Vito. Scott tries taking swings at Vito, but Vito snaps the paddle in half and punches Scott into the water. Scott is in the water, but is able to be saved by Duncan and Gwen, who are right behind. Duncan tries to speed up to catch Heather, but the engine busts, and he's like, man, I should have voted Heather out before. Gwen is sad that this could be their defeat and one of us is going home. As Gwen is crying, Scott and Duncan would comfort her, saying even if one of us goes home, we will keep fighting, and it's not too late to convince one of Heather's allies, right? This gives Gwen some hope, enough to continue on and get the boat working again. Heather arrives first, winning immunity and inviting one person to the mansion. The others catch up soon though. These guys are bummed, but they don't lose hope in convincing Heather's allies to turn on her and getting her out. Later, Scott goes up to Heather, who is talking with her allies, and he would ask, is it too late to join your alliance? He's infiltrating. Heather would say yes and tell Scott to back off. Scott walks back to these guys who are planning who to vote out. Gwen points out we can't vote Heather, and we wouldn't want to vote on any of Heather's allies, or else Heather will have a reason for them to stay, being that we tried to vote them out. Even if we get one out, we're not gaining the trust of the others. Courtney would complain because even if they vote for one of us, we can win the tiebreaker, and who cares about their feelings? But Gwen would want their trust, because she has a good heart and wants to save them from Heather. But one of us has to go out for that. It's either they are manipulated and lose, or they have an actual shot at the money. Courtney is touched by Scott, who reasons they need a shot at the money. More like he needs people he can freely sabotage. So they decide to just vote themselves, and be ready to be eliminated. In the elimination, Heather and her alliance vote out Courtney, getting her out. Courtney would kind of be sad she agreed to the plan, but Scott would hold her hand and take her to the dock while eyeing Heather, who waves back. Scott and Courtney say their goodbyes, and they spare a kiss. Pretty romantic stuff, and Courtney leaves. Scott has a confessional where he says he'll step up the sabotaging on Heather. Oh yeah, and Heather brings Cameron to the mansion, so she can manipulate him more into trusting her. In the mansion, Chris wouldn't take over as Duncan doesn't blow up his mansion. In the mansion, we can see Heather pretend to be nice and make promises to Cameron to the finale, as long as he doesn't turn on her. Cameron asks what about Mike and Zoe, and Heather's like, yeah, they will too, but allying with you is now my main priority, as I value you a lot. Cameron would sadly fall for Heather, and would put all his trust into Heather. Meanwhile, Gwen is talking with Mike and Zoe about the dangers of Heather and how she was in Season 1. Yeah, Mike and Zoe are freaked out by what Heather did, like betraying Lindsay in her alliance. They know now they shouldn't trust. As they are talking, Heather and Cameron walk into the cabin to grab Mike and Zoe. Heather and Cameron confront the two about talking to enemies, and Mike and Zoe would say that Gwen tried to get them in an alliance, but they refused. Heather's like, good, because you are already in an alliance with me, you know, and you can trust me till the end, because I'll take one of you guys, but I'll help the other two along the way, and get rid of evils like Gwen. Cameron says, yeah, we get a chance to win with Heather, and Mike and Zoe are concerned with what Heather has done with Cameron. This is the 100th episode I've gone through, y'all. I think Chris would still be kidnapped by Ezekiel, and Chef forces the campers to get Chris. Heather would ask Chef if the winner wins the mansion for the night, and a person of choice with them along with immunity in the vote. And Chef's like, yeah, whatever, go get Chris. Heather and her alliance dig holes and go through there, and these three go through the same tunnel Scott and Courtney did. Gwen would be afraid to go in because of her fear, but we can see Duncan and Scott comforting her, bringing the three closer. Heather would send Zoe to the three so she can sabotage them by separating one from the group. Mike and Zoe think it's a bit evil, but Cameron tells them they have to, so Zoe goes and finds the three. Duncan asks Zoe where'd she come from, and she'd lie and say she was left in the dark and got lost and ended up here. Duncan is like, this is why you can't trust Heather. She leaves you in the dark. Zoe would be like, yeah, and Heather senses something wrong with that awkward response. Gwen asks Zoe if there's anything she's hiding. Zoe awkwardly says no, and when they're near a pit, Zoe would push Gwen and jump in, leaving Duncan and Scott. Gwen would be screaming so loud. Duncan tries to reach out, but he gets no response, and gets all angry at Zoe for doing this. Scott would say that they shouldn't go down to help them or they could lose the challenge, and a potential ally. Duncan would agree and keep moving on, sadly. Later, Heather expects Zoe to come back, but she doesn't, and would force Mike to go get her. Mike would threaten Heather that if Zoe is nowhere to be found, he's leaving the alliance and goes to find Zoe. It's just Heather and Cameron who are planning the voting. Heather proposes she saves Chris and gets the alliance to vote for Gwen, as she's constantly trying to get you guys to turn on me. Cameron would agree to this, and Heather's like good and continues to talk about more stuff, but Cameron would sense something moving from behind them, and he looks back, and Ezekiel jump scares the two, and Heather runs away. Ezekiel captures Cameron. Ezekiel would also capture Gwen and Zoe at some point too. As Duncan and Scott are walking, they also sense some noise of something following them, and what do you know? Ezekiel appears and tries to grab both Duncan and Scott, but Duncan would tell Scott to find Chris and continue on without him. Scott would comply and leave Duncan, who tries to battle Ezekiel but fails. I'm sure soon, Heather and Scott would make it to the same cave from two different entrances, and Chef would arrive with the meat cannon. The scene goes like this. Heather pokes the rats, but he gets blasted by Ezekiel. Scott tries to untie Chris, but is pushed by Heather. Heather would try to untie, but Ezekiel would pounce at her, getting her under the rocks, but Scott is able to grab the gun and blast Ezekiel. Heather is saved, but grabs the gun and blasts Scott, and Heather's able to save Chris and everyone. Cameron is happy, Mike and Zoe are somewhat happy, Gwen and Duncan know what's happening next. For the votes, they can't vote out Heather, at first because Zoe can be their ally, and a good competitor against Heather, but Scott would say that when Heather's gone, Zoe will be the biggest threat, as she can be athletic at times. It takes a little bit, but Gwen sadly agrees. Heather and Cameron would see how dangerous of an opponent Scott is, and they tell Mike and Zoe to vote for him, but Mike and Zoe feel they shouldn't, as they're trying to save them from Heather. They vote for Cameron instead. In the votes, Zoe won't complain or anything. She would just yell at Cameron, "This is what you have done because you teamed with Heather." Cameron and Mike would be like, "No," but Heather shuts Cameron, and Zoe tells Mike, "It's okay, the three are trying to teach us something, and you should trust them instead of Heather." Deadly obstacle course time. Heather is back from the mansion with Cameron. They visit Mike, who's questioning if he wants to be in the alliance anymore. Heather tells Mike, "Do not dare question the alliance. This is the perfect alliance to be in." We get an epic scene, Mike raging that Heather's alliance caused Zoe to go, and he can't forgive them for that. Heather sighs, asking Cameron if he can do anything about this, and Cameron would change Mike's personality to Vito. As Cameron pulls Mike's shirt, Mike's like, "Don't you dare pull my shirt off." And Cameron's like, "I'm sorry, Mike." Yeah, Cameron is telling Mike's other personalities, but Chester does not trust Duncan. Yeah, Cameron is telling Mike's other personalities. In the obstacle challenge, Scott devises a plan. Duncan would get quite ahead to check if the obstacles are safe or not. Gwen wouldn't have to worry, as Scott is helping her, and Scott would sabotage Heather and her team at the same time. Yep, they agreed to this. They tried to get Mike, but Vito would push them away and call them losers. For the first part, the tires, Duncan would speed through to get to the next part. In turn, Heather tells Vito to get ahead, but Cameron's able to give a pep talk to activate Svetlana, who uses her acrobatics to get across. Scott, who is in front, would notice Svetlana, and he will start chucking tires at Heather and her team. He chucks a few at Svetlana, and after an especially hard hit, Chester is activated because Svetlana would be tired of being pelted by tires. Yeah, that was a terrible joke. Cameron would immediately call for a pep talk, activating Svetlana again, giving Scott an idea on how to counter Mike's personalities later. Scott would go ahead, making sure Gwen climbs the ropes, and is able to get up before Cameron finishes the tires. Now I can see Mike getting far with his personalities. Heather's alright, but I can see Cameron struggling when he gets in the tires, and he gets tired and can't move up no more. And that's another bad joke. Because of this, Scott chews on the licorice rope, bites through the dog hair, and sets the regular rope on fire with the electrical cord, which starts to burn the rope wall a bit. Svetlana would see the fire, but Cameron takes off the shirt and gets Vito to throw him over the wall. Vito would then jump over the wall like it's nothing, but Heather's left behind asking for help and is forced to be zapped by the electrical cord. Cameron would then tell Vito to throw him across the monkey bars, and Vito does, and Cameron gets a big head start. Gwen is finishing up on the monkey bars, but Scott would not let Vito or Heather past, instead going on top to wait for Vito. When Vito is right below, Scott jumps down to grab onto Vito. Vito would try to get Scott to let go, but Scott is able to fall along with Vito into the piranha-infested water. When Heather gets to the monkey bars, Scott pulls her down, and the three get into a brawl. Later, Gwen finds Duncan resting with a bunch of leeches on his face. Gwen would ask what happened, and Duncan says he has struggled with the leeches, but Gwen would wipe them out and take Duncan with her. Cameron would come running full speed from behind and pass Gwen and Duncan. Duncan sees this, but would immediately tackle Cameron, so he stays behind. When Cameron, Gwen, and Duncan make it to the zipline, Gwen suggests they shouldn't leave Scott behind, and they end up waiting while Duncan is messing with Cameron, who is telling them to stop. The three fighters would get out of the water at the same time and would go through the leech shooting area. Heather's too beat up to continue, but she asks Vito if he can literally carry her to the end. And Vito does. Vito would be running pretty fast, passing Scott. Scott knows that with him running, he can't beat Vito, so he steals Chef's leech gun and shoots the two, causing them to tumble and Scott to pass them. Scott meets up with Gwen and Duncan and would start ziplining with them, but Cameron does not let Duncan slide and jumps onto Duncan to ride him. Duncan tries his hardest to twirl around to get him off, but ends up unclipping himself and Cameron. Gwen would worry about Duncan, but is more focused on the win, which she gets. Heather and Vito would be complaining, and it is elimination time. Scott would be telling Duncan and Gwen they should get Cameron as he will not give up, and is too aligned with Heather. So, a perfect way to get back at Heather is to vote one ally off. Gwen would be like, shouldn't we be voting for Heather because she's the main villain? And Scott is playing, and he wants Cameron out for Heather to get a taste of sabotage. Well, I partly want a more interesting story. Scott would come get Vito and would shovel him to the head to hopefully knock him out and wake up as Mike. This would not sit well with Cameron and Heather, who try to drag Vito back, but are threatened by Scott holding the shovel, and they let Vito get dragged by Scott. Yeah, this could be the end of Heather, and Heather's freaking out, and is so angry that this could be the end of her, and vents her rage to Cameron, who apologizes to her. Yeah, in the elimination, Heather is safe, because Cameron is out, and he's taken by surprise, and Heather's celebrating, and thankfully, the four decided to keep her. Oh my gosh, not gonna lie though, I think I focused more on story than realism. My bad. I should mix it a little bit, maybe. Derailment Central. Heather is exiled to Boney Island. Throughout the night, Scott would be training Mike's personalities to work for him instead. He basically does this by activating a personality. Yeah, he knows how to activate, he just hasn't thought of doing it before. And then he would threaten to whack the head if the personalities don't comply with him. Yeah, this works. In the morning, Heather comes back and tries to thank everyone for sparing her, but everyone ignores her, except Scott, who would reply. Scott would now wants to pretend to ally with Heather and constantly boss her throughout the challenge. Yeah, some good old payback, as Scott already has the votes to get her out, but wants to get revenge for a satisfying end to her. Heather would awkwardly ask if Scott can ally with her and Mike so we can get Gwen out. Scott would say that Mike only listens to him now. Scott would say, I'll only work with you if you listen to what I say, because with me, you have a vote and an extra vote, which makes 3-2 against Gwen. Also, Heather can't activate any of Mike's personalities. It's such a shame, because Heather says in the confessional she plans to use Mike in the challenge. Heather really needs some allies and thinks Scott is the best, and promises to do what he says as long as she has his votes. Y'all know where this is going. For the ice cream, we can see everyone climbing together, though Scott would tell Mike to slide into Heather when going down to get at her. Duncan and Gwen get their ice cream, Mike too, and he slides into Heather, causing her to slide back a little. Scott would throw spoons away and would wait for Heather to get on top. And Scott asks Heather what took her so long, and to grab some ice cream because the spoons are missing, and his hands are about to be frostbit. Heather rolls her eyes and gets herself and Scott some ice cream, and they slide together. As Gwen and Duncan navigate the swamp, Mike would pass them by swinging the vine. Gwen and Duncan then shift their conversation to voting Mike next after Heather. As Gwen and Duncan make it back, Scott arrives and tells Gwen to throw a rock at the bowl after Scott grabs a cherry, and Gwen would like the sight of Heather picking swamp cherries. Scott would navigate and Heather is behind. Scott would grab a cherry and give the thumbs up to Gwen, who knocks down the cherries into the water. And to put the cherry on top, the cherries sink, causing Heather to angrily sigh and go underwater for a cherry. Mike would struggle around the robot, getting chased by it. Duncan and Gwen arrived and get the nuts. Scott would eventually arrive, and he sprinkles some on his and on Mike's while he's running. He then knocks the nuts onto the ground, and Heather arrives. Scott is like, "Oh no, how can Duncan do this?" and pretends to grab some on the floor. The nuts disgust Heather, but she tries to grab some. Mike and Scott then leave, causing the robot to go to Heather, and it smashes her bowl, causing her to carry a broken bowl. Lastly, Gwen and Duncan try to distract the flaming flower with each other so they both get chocolate. Mike and Scott arrive, and Scott distracts from Mike, and Scott tells Mike to distract the flower, even after he gets some chocolate, so Scott can direct the fire onto the chocolate, burning it. This works, as when Heather arrives, the chocolate is burnt, and Scott blames Mike, but Scott says he'll distract the flower. Heather is really grossed out knowing where the ingredients came from. Gwen makes it first, Duncan, Mike, Scott, and lastly Heather. Chris announces that the campers have to eat their own sundaes. Heather is not thrilled, as she has to eat burnt swamp cherries, but she tries to eat it. Between everyone, I think Duncan would love his sundae and chomps it down real fast. As they're eating, Scott asks Heather, "Aren't you gonna eat your sundae, which has cherries marinated in swamp water, nuts from dirty mess hall floor, and burnt ash chocolate?" This description makes Heather barf, and she ends up not finishing her ice cream bowl. Heather becomes angry with Scott and is yelling, "I have had enough of your help, Scott. You are the worst ally." Scott would then pretend to feel broken from those statements and would now say, "Because you said that, I won't vote with you," which makes Heather scream as she quits. Yeah, everyone is voting for her and she's out. She will tell Scott that she'll get her lawyers involved, just like she said in Island, and everyone is satisfied with her defeat. Imagine if this went down in the show. Actually, imagine how satisfying this would be. Okay, y'all, double elimination time. I'll go through this quickly so we can get to the finale. For the items, the people still get their items. Mike and the Gilded Chris Award, Scott and the Diamond, and Gwen with the portrait of Chris, but this time, Chris would hide them in secret in his mansion, and Duncan would be getting Sasquatch and Aqua. Now, Scott would just use Mike's personalities to his advantage at this point. Scott would tell Mike that he'll take him to the finale if he'll help him, and Mike agrees. Scott then takes off Mike's shirt to activate Vito. They arrive at the pirate ship with Fang, who has the diamond on his tooth. No problem, though, because Vito can just punch Fang and retrieve the diamond. Now, Scott would pretend to get Mike's Gilded Chris statue, but on the way, he just leaves Vito to go sabotage Gwen and Duncan. Scott arrives at the mansion with his diamond in his pocket, and Gwen is looking for the portrait. Now, Scott would pretend to get Mike's Gilded Chris statue, but on the way, he just leaves Vito to go sabotage Gwen and Duncan. Scott arrives at the mansion with his diamond in his pocket, and Gwen looking for the portrait. Scott would pretend to help Gwen, but instead would look for one and snap it to pieces. Yeah, Chris would have a lot of portraits, so Scott is able to find a few and snap it. And when Gwen finds a portrait, Scott would pretend to take a look, but accidentally snaps it, making Gwen find another one. This goes on for a while until Gwen gets a bit suspicious with all the broken portraits, and Scott leaves to sabotage Duncan. Duncan would have found out Sasquatch and Aqua cares about his eggs, so he grabs them and lets Sasquatch and Aqua chase after him. Scott would see Duncan being chased and holding the eggs, so he would trip Duncan, sending the eggs flying, and Scott would catch them and would lead Sasquatch and Aqua to the ocean. After throwing the eggs into the ocean, Duncan gets very mad, but notices Scott has his diamonds, so he would be fighting Scott over it. Duncan would acquire the diamond and would take it to Chris to hopefully win for himself. Scott would be chasing after the diamond, and once they get to Chris, They have a fighting scene one last time, but Chris would break up the fight and Duncan shows Scott's diamond. Chris would tell Duncan that he got Scott's diamond and Scott wins because the diamond was brought to him first. Gwen would soon arrive with a broken portrait. Duncan and Mike would return with no item. I could see either two scenarios happening. One, Chris just boots both of them because they don't have an item, or Chris boots Mike for showing up last and lets Scott choose who's going next. I feel like Chris would do the first one, so that means Duncan and Mike are out. Gwen and Scott are very sad because they wanted to go to the finale with their friends. Duncan would tell Gwen to watch out for Scott because he sabotaged both of us, and who knows how long he has been sabotaging, while Mike just tells Scott that he's thankful he was saved from Heather's manipulation. Okay, even if Chris chose the second option, Mike would still get out for arriving last, and Scott would pick Duncan as he's a bigger threat and stronger than Gwen. Finale time, y'all. Okay, since this is the finale, I'll treat it more like a rewrite, since both winners have their alternate endings. For the weapon choice, Scott gets the meat gun and Gwen gets the leech gun. For the helpers, this is interesting. Gwen would shoot down Cameron and Lightning, who Gwen isn't very excited to work with. Scott would struggle to shoot directly, but he eventually gets Joe and Sierra. There we have Sierra trying to reunite with Cameron, and Joe would take jabs at Lightning for not supporting her as leader. Scott would jokingly shoot Gwen's team, but ends up angering Sierra, who is not happy that Cameron has been shot, so she punches Scott for attacking Cameron. Chris breaks up the fighting and introduces the final challenge. Gwen would be awkward with Cameron and Lightning and wouldn't talk to them much. Lightning would be hating on Cameron, though, but he doesn't take hits as he doesn't want to be beat by Sierra. Joe wouldn't work with Scott, knowing he didn't support her as leader, but tries to help him. Sierra would be staring at Cameron all challenged, but Joe would slap the crap out of her and get her attention, and that just starts a fight. Scott tries getting help from the two to cross the acid, but to no avail. Lightning and Cameron are just eyeing each other, but Gwen tries to break them up, but they keep eyeing. Gwen would tell the two that if they help her, they'll get a small chunk of the million, which Cameron and Lightning are down for. So Lightning would throw Gwen and Cameron to the other side. Lightning is now stuck, but Cameron would suggest to use sticks as stilts. Scott would see almost all of Gwen's team across, so he would grab his sticks and whack Lightning in the head, knocking him out, and forcing Gwen and Cameron to move on. Scott would have noticed Sierra can get pretty strong when Cameron's in danger, so he would pretend Cameron's with Gwen, who is dangerous, and plans to throw Cameron into the lava. And she should throw him so he can save him. This gets Sierra angry, and she throws Scott, but would also think of using sticks as stilts to pass the acid, leaving Joe behind. Next is the lava part. Gwen would immediately use the ladder bridge to get across, but Scott isn't far behind and would almost cross the bridge, but it burns. So he would use the pogo stick to get across, which he does, but he leaves Sierra behind. As soon as he climbs up, Gwen is looking out for the sharks. Scott wouldn't think of anything, but Gwen says look out, and Fang would emerge from the water and start beating up Scott. Now Gwen can either move on without Scott and win, or she can save Scott and strengthen the friendship. Gwen has a good heart, so she would call out for Cameron and or Sierra to help beat up Fang. She and Scott wouldn't be able to do it alone. Gwen screams out help. Cameron would hear while Sierra is loving him. Cameron would think of how both he and Sierra can get across, and he thinks of this. Sierra would throw him to the other side, and then Cameron throws a pogo stick to her, and she gets across, and this is exactly what happens, and Sierra's able to beat up Fang once and for all, and Scott would be thanking Gwen and Sierra for saving his life, and everyone continues to go up. In Gwen's ending, Chef would focus on shooting Scott, and Gwen is in the clear to pull the sword off. In Scott's ending, Chef focuses on Gwen, giving him the clear to pull the sword. Yeah, Gwen would be happy and Scott would be happy no matter what. Sierra's just happy to be with Cameron, and the entire island would sink because of Chef's fracking machine. And that is what I think would happen if Scott kept his self-sabotage strategy from revenge. We get a bunch of changes like Lightning staying much further, Heather becoming a main antagonist, Cameron dealing with Sierra earlier, Alejandro being voted out pre-merge, Scott and Gwen making it to finale, Duncan not having his I'm a bad boy arc, Duncan and Gwen getting back together, Scott and Courtney remaining a couple, Mal not existing, and Heather forming an alliance with the three. Also more interactions between generation casts. I'd say I've focused a bit more on the story than realism on this what if. I'm happy with the outcome, but this could have totally been written differently. I decided to go with Scott remembering rather than him sabotaging from the start for a much interesting story. I don't know. I feel like I could have written more sabotaging schemes in the beginning rather than the second half of the season, but I feel like this is fine. I actually thought I would struggle with writing this season. I thought the challenges and the new people would be hard, but I found out writing this is not as hard as I imagined. I also had the mindset of more interactions between Gen 1 and 2 cast, because I feel like there could have been more done with the All-Star cast. And I tried to combine their All-Star and pre-All-Star personalities, because I think I would have struggled to write with an almost different cast. Here's the voting chart. I want to thank y'all on my 200 subs. From last video, we got from 100 to 200, which is incredibly amazing. I want to thank y'all for subscribing and supporting the channel. Y'all mean the world, and I want to thank y'all for the tremendous support on the Mal video. Thanks everyone so much. Also, in regards to a special for hitting a milestone like 100, I didn't think of one recently, and I'm sorry for no special right now. Though now, I planned stuff for a 500 and a 1000 sub special. If I hit any of those milestones, I'll give y'all the chance to choose between some special / brand new ideas, like an unscripted what if, or letting a wheel choose the order of elimination, and then I have to write a realistic scenario in which the story plays out for the chosen character to get out. I have many ideas, but we'll see at 500 and 1000 subs. Anyways, thanks for watching the video and supporting my last one. Leave your Pahkitew Island ideas in the comments. Again, if you're the original commenter, I'll pin your comment down below. I'll see y'all in my Pahkitew Island video. Bye y'all.